She said yes to a man in a wheelchair, but what happened at the altar left the entire crowd in tears. A secret training, an impossible vow, and a moment that defied every expectation. This isn't just a love story, it's a miracle in motion. You won't believe what he did when the music played, and she walked toward him. Where are you watching from? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful true stories like this one. Claire Hadley wasn't looking for anyone. Not that rainy Tuesday afternoon, not in that dusty corner of the town's oldest library, and certainly not after the year she'd had. Divorce papers barely dried, a career shift looming like a gray cloud, and the silence of a home once filled with laughter. It was enough to make even the brightest smile fade. So she went to the one place that never asked her to pretend, the Rosewood Public Library. It smelled like old pages, fresh coffee, and quiet hope. She wandered past familiar rows of biographies and dog-eared paperbacks, letting her fingers trail along the spines like greeting old friends. That's when it happened. A thick hardcover, shelved a bit too high, teetered and dropped toward her. She reached for it instinctively, but someone else caught it first. A pair of calm, weathered hands intercepted the fall. She turned, startled. Sitting there was a man, late 30s maybe, with dark, thoughtful eyes and an old, worn-out wheelchair that looked as much a part of him as the coat he wore. He handed her the book, his lips curling into a half-smile. "This one's heavier than it looks." Claire blinked. "You caught that like a pro," he chuckled, voice low and warm. "Been catching falling things for a while." She smiled before she realized it. "Claire?" "Daniel," he replied simply. No fanfare, no awkward stares, just a name passed like a quiet handshake. They stood, he sat, facing each other for a beat longer than strangers usually do. She nodded and moved on, heart beating faster than it should have. But she didn't make it far before curiosity tugged her back. Over the next week, then 2, then 3, Claire found herself showing up more and more. Always the same section. Always near the same time. And almost always, Daniel was there, by the tall window overlooking the park, a book in his lap and headphones in his ears. Sometimes he hummed softly. Jazz, she thought, or maybe old folk songs. Eventually they spoke again, this time about the author he was reading. Then about libraries. Then about life. He wasn't a talker, not the rambling kind. But when he did speak, his words landed like poetry, measured, meaningful, and just a little melancholy. He told her about his love for Ray Bradbury, how fiction let you rewrite endings. She listened. Then, to her surprise, she spoke. She told him about her grandmother, about writing letters to her late mother she never mailed, and how some nights she sat on the porch alone because silence felt more honest than company. He listened, really listened, and never once tried to fix her. That's what caught her off guard. No advice, no pity, just presence. The kind of presence that reminded you weren't broken, just tired. It was a few weeks in when she asked him gently, "What happened, if that's okay to ask?" He didn't flinch. He closed the book in his lap, folded his hands. "Car accident, 3 years ago. Drunk driver, spinal cord injury." He said it like a fact, not a tragedy. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, "I was lucky to survive. Some days I believe that, some days not so much." Claire didn't offer a platitude. She just reached across the space between them and touched his hand. "I'm glad you did." From that day on, things shifted. Their talks grew longer, their silences even more comfortable. Claire's best friend Maggie noticed the change before Claire admitted it herself. "You've got that look," Maggie said over brunch one weekend. Claire rolled her eyes. "What look?" "The one people get when they're about to do something that scares them." Claire didn't argue, because she knew Maggie was right. Falling for someone again wasn't part of her plan. And falling for someone in a wheelchair, that came with questions. From others, from herself. But not from Daniel. He never once asked her to save him or make him feel whole. He was already whole. Bent in places, yes, but whole. Claire once told her grandmother Evelyn about him. Evelyn, a fiery 74-year-old with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, listened quietly, then said, "If he makes you smile with your eyes, not just your lips, then he's worth keeping." That night, as Claire sat on her porch with a cup of chamomile tea and Daniel's voice in her head, she realized something. The world might not always understand love that looks different, but she did. And as far as she was concerned, that was enough. Claire knew, falling in love with Daniel wouldn't be easy, not because of him. He was thoughtful, kind, the kind of man who noticed when her shoulders tensed and asked about it in the gentlest voice. No, it wasn't Daniel that complicated things. It was everything outside of him. The world had a way of looking at wheelchairs like they were cages, and at people like her, walking beside them as either saints or fools. She wasn't either. She just loved him. But love doesn't exist in a vacuum. It started with the stares. They were subtle at first. Prolonged glances at restaurants, in parks, from strangers who tilted their heads just a little when they saw her hand in his. Then came the comments. Polite on the surface, but dipped in condescension. "You're such an angel," one barista said after watching Claire help Daniel adjust his gloves. Claire had smiled then, but it clung to her like static. She wasn't an angel. She was a woman in love with a man who happened to use wheels instead of legs. The people closest to her didn't make it easier. During lunch with Maggie one Saturday, Claire finally shared the news. "He asked me to marry him," she said, trying to suppress the nervous flutter in her voice. "And I said yes." There was a pause just long enough to hurt. Maggie blinked. "Wow, that's fast." Claire stirred her pasta, heart pounding. "It's been months." "Yeah, but are you sure?" Maggie's voice softened like she was speaking to a child. "Claire, I mean, you won't be able to hike again, or dance at parties, hospitals, caregiving. It's going to be a lot." Claire looked up. "I'm not marrying a lifestyle, I'm marrying a person." "I know, I want you to think about forever." Those words sat in Claire's chest like wet cement. Forever. Not in fairy tales or vows, but in ramps and elevators that didn't work, in people who asked her what he wanted to eat. She hadn't thought about all of it. Not until now. That night, Claire lay awake, the bedroom dark and quiet, except for the soft hum of rain tapping the windows. She loved Daniel. That much was certain. But now her thoughts spiraled. What if she couldn't handle it? What if love wasn't enough? Meanwhile, Daniel was fighting battles of his own. What Claire didn't know was that he'd already started training. Weeks before the proposal, he had reached out to Dr. Whitaker, a neuro-rehabilitation specialist known for pushing the boundaries of what medicine dared to promise. Daniel had asked a simple question. "Is it possible for someone like me to stand, even briefly?" Dr. Whitaker had replied without hesitation. "Not to walk a marathon. But if you're willing to suffer, truly suffer, maybe, for seconds." That was all Daniel needed to hear. 3 mornings a week, before Claire even opened her eyes, Daniel was already in the car with Terrence, his lifelong friend and now secret accomplice, heading to the outskirts of town. The sessions were brutal. Muscles that had long forgotten their duty screamed with every attempt. Sweat soaked through his shirts. His fingers trembled from gripping parallel bars. But he never stopped. He didn't tell Claire. Not because he wanted to lie, but because he didn't want to raise her hopes. If it failed, he'd still be the same man she loved. But if he succeeded, just for one moment, he could give her something she'd never expect. A man who rose for her, even for 5 seconds. Back at home, Claire was adjusting to a different kind of discomfort. Wedding planning had begun. Venues, florists, music. But something in her shifted. She started noticing how stylists suggested dresses with short trains, just in case, how photographers subtly asked if they should avoid full-body shots. Nobody meant harm, but the message was always there. You're marrying someone who sits, so you must learn to lower your expectations. One evening, after a long day of backhanded compliments and polite pity, Claire broke down at her grandmother's kitchen table. Evelyn poured tea, sat beside her, and said nothing at first. Just waited. "I don't know if I can do this," Claire whispered. Tears caught in her throat. "Not because I don't love him. God, I love him. But because I don't know if the world will ever stop looking at us like we're a story they pity instead of a life we chose." Evelyn reached over, wrapping her weathered hands around Claire's trembling ones. "Sweetheart," she said, voice steady, "every love has its fight. Yours just happens to roll on wheels instead of walk on feet. But it's still love. Don't let anyone else write your ending for you." Claire looked at her grandmother and felt something settle inside her. A quiet knowing. The kind that doesn't come from certainty but from faith. In him, in herself, in what they had. Meanwhile, across town, Daniel sat on a training mat, legs trembling, back aching, eyes shut tight against the sweat dripping into them. Dr. Whitaker stood nearby, arms folded, watching him collapse for the third time that hour. "You sure about this?" the doctor asked. Daniel didn't hesitate. "I have to be." And in that shared silence, her fears, his fight, their love grew stronger, inch by inch, breath by breath. Neither knew exactly what tomorrow would bring, but both had decided to show up for it anyway. Claire had always believed love was about presence, about showing up when it was easier to walk away. And Daniel? He showed up in ways most people never would. He remembered how she liked her tea. 1 sugar, no milk. He sent her playlists that matched her mood before she even told him how she was feeling. He never rushed her silences, never interrupted her stories. But in the weeks after the engagement, Claire noticed something had shifted. Not in their love, but in Daniel. He'd become quieter. Not distant, but distant adjacent. Sometimes when she called, it would go to voicemail. When they were together, he smiled, laughed even, but his eyes seemed to be holding something. One afternoon, she asked him gently, "You okay?" "Yeah," he said too quickly. "Just a lot going on with the wedding stuff." She didn't push. She trusted him. But the truth was, Daniel wasn't just busy with wedding plans. Every morning before sunrise, while Claire still slept, Daniel rode with Terence to the clinic an hour away. There, he met with Dr. Whitaker and stood, sometimes only for seconds, sometimes with so much pain he nearly blacked out. But he kept showing up because he wasn't training his legs. He was preparing his soul. For a moment, for her. It wasn't about ego. Not for Daniel. He didn't want applause. He didn't want to walk again just to prove something to the world. He wanted to stand just once, so that when Claire walked down the aisle, he could rise to meet her. Not because she needed it, but because he wanted to give her the kind of memory that could silence every whisper, every stare, every half-smile that said "poor girl" behind her back. The therapy sessions were grueling. Each step was a war. His body, unused to bearing weight, rebelled with every twitch. He vomited more than once from the strain, bruised, bled, cried in silence. But he never told Claire. Instead, he smiled through their dinner dates, helped her glue tiny pressed flowers onto handmade invitations, and rehearsed their vows with steady breath and steady hands, even as his legs trembled from exhaustion. Meanwhile, Claire was fighting her own silent battles. Her friends were supportive, but still curious. Maggie, especially, had softened since the engagement announcement, but Claire could feel the unasked questions behind her eyes. And even when no one said anything, the world said plenty. Vendors paused when they realized who the groom was. Stylists suggested wheelchair-friendly layout options without being asked. Even the caterer asked if Daniel would need special seating accommodations, as though he were attending as a guest rather than starring in the story. Every time, Claire smiled politely. Every time, something inside her wilted just a little. One evening, as they walked, or rather rolled around a quiet lake trail, Daniel paused beneath a willow tree. The late spring sun filtered through its curtain of green, painting his face in gold. "Do you ever think," Claire began, her voice barely above a whisper, "that I might get tired of this? Of not walking beside you?" Daniel didn't flinch. He didn't sigh. He simply turned to her, eyes steady. "I think about it every day," he said. Claire looked away, ashamed. But he continued, "Not because I don't believe in us. I do. But because for a long time after the accident, I believed everyone would leave. And most of them did. But you didn't. You stayed." She blinked back tears. "I'm not going anywhere." "I know," he said, voice almost breaking. "That's why I can finally breathe again." That night, back at her grandmother Evelyn's house, Claire pulled out an old leather scrapbook. She began filling it with photos of the two of them in the library, sipping coffee on rainy days, dancing in their kitchen with only upper bodies swaying. On the last page, she wrote a note. "I never imagined I'd fall in love with someone who couldn't walk beside me. But that's only because I never imagined love could be this steady, this kind. You showed me that strength doesn't live in footsteps, it lives in staying." She wrapped it in a ribbon and gave it to him the next morning, just before heading out to finalize the cake flavors. Daniel opened it after she left. He read every word, touched every photo, and when he reached the end, he wept, silently, shoulders shaking, clutching the book like it held his heart. Because now he wasn't just training to stand. He had to stand. For her. For them. Later that week, during a training session that left him breathless and soaked in sweat, Dr. Whitaker crouched beside him, concern etched into every wrinkle on his face. "Daniel," he said seriously, "you can't push this too far. One wrong step, one fall, you could re-injure your spine." "I've done the math," Daniel whispered. "One fall won't kill me, but missing this moment, not trying, that might." Dr. Whitaker stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Then let's give her the moment she deserves." And so, between shared silences and secret suffering, Claire and Daniel moved closer to a wedding no one would forget. A day built not on fairy tales, but on quiet vows, impossible dreams, and a love that never asked for more than the truth. The morning of the wedding broke with a kind of stillness that felt sacred. The sky was a soft, endless blue, and the lake by the venue shimmered like glass. Wildflowers nodded in the breeze. The air carried the scent of spring and something else, anticipation. It was as if the world itself had paused to hold its breath for Claire and Daniel. Claire stood in the bridal suite, staring at her reflection. Her dress flowed like mist, simple and graceful, chosen not for grandeur but for ease, something she could kneel in beside Daniel's chair. Her hair was pinned with delicate white blossoms, her lips painted a soft rose. Yet her hands trembled. "You look like you stepped out of a dream," Evelyn whispered, wiping a proud tear before it could fall. Claire smiled but didn't speak. Something inside her felt restless. Daniel had been distant the past few days, disappearing for hours, brushing off questions with charming distractions. It wasn't coldness, it was purpose. But she didn't understand what for. Across the venue, in a quiet wooden cabin, Daniel sat in front of a mirror. Terence, his best man, helped adjust his tie with trembling fingers. The braces beneath Daniel's tailored black suit were tight, hidden, heavy. His arms ached. His legs had barely slept. "You sure you want to do this?" Terence asked, not referring to the vows. Daniel stared at himself. He looked pale, his lips dry, sweat already rising along his hairline. But his eyes were steady. "I've already done the hard part," he said. "I fell in love. Now I just have to rise into it." Outside, the guests began arriving, their voices hushed with curiosity. Claire had kept the ceremony small, just family and a few close friends. Maggie arrived with a bouquet of tulips and tearful eyes. She hadn't always understood Claire's choice, but now, watching the venue glow under the late morning sun, she felt a shift in her heart. Soft music began, guitar strings and the faint murmur of a violin. Bridesmaids glided down the aisle in pale gold dresses. The ring-bearer wobbled with his little pillow. Then the crowd hushed. Claire appeared. Gasps rose softly around the rows of white chairs as she stepped into view. Arm linked with Evelyn's. Her dress caught the light with every step, her face calm, but her eyes searched. Not the crowd. Him. Daniel was at the front, seated as expected. But something about his posture was different. He wasn't resting, he was preparing. The officiant's voice rose. "All who are able, please rise for the bride." And Daniel moved. Quietly, deliberately, he reached for the hidden stabilizer bars built into his custom chair. Terence knelt beside him in case he faltered. Daniel gripped the braces, exhaled slowly, and pushed. For a moment, it was as if time refused to pass. Then, he stood. The first few rows gasped. A ripple of surprise surged through the crowd. Claire, halfway down the aisle, froze. Her bouquet dropped. Her hands flew to her mouth as tears filled her eyes in an instant. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. All she could do was stare at the man who wasn't supposed to be able to stand. But there he was, shaking, straining, glorious. Daniel locked eyes with her. He didn't smile, he burned. Every ounce of pain, every moment of doubt, every whispered no from doctors and friends, he was defying them all. Not to be heroic, not to prove anything, but to love. And then he took a step. Claire collapsed to her knees mid-aisle, her body overtaken by sobs, hands covering her face. Then she stood, almost on instinct, and ran, dress billowing, hair coming loose, barefoot by the time she reached him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, shaking, crying, laughing all at once. "How?" she whispered against his chest. "How did you?" Daniel held her close, his entire body trembling. "For you," he breathed. "I wanted to give you one moment the world said I never could." She looked up at him, mascara smudged, eyes shining like dawn. "You've already given me everything," she whispered. "But this is a miracle." They stood there like that, just holding each other, while the crowd wiped tears, while the musicians played through trembling fingers, while the officiant waited with reverent silence. No one moved, no one dared. Eventually Daniel sank slowly back into his chair, exhausted but victorious. Claire knelt beside him, hands still in his. The ceremony resumed. They exchanged vows, his voice shaking, hers steady. They promised not just to love, but to stay, to believe, to choose each other every day, even when the world didn't understand. And when the moment came, "You may kiss the bride." Claire leaned in, but Daniel stopped her. He braced himself once more and lifted just enough to meet her halfway. Their lips touched, and the crowd erupted. Applause, tears, cheers. But Daniel didn't hear any of it. All he felt was Claire, and the promise they'd just sealed in front of everyone who had ever doubted what love could look like. Later, under the blooming canopy, Evelyn whispered to her granddaughter, "That wasn't just a wedding. That was a resurrection." Claire smiled through her tears. She couldn't have said it better herself. That night, beneath a canopy of stars and the soft hum of laughter from the reception tent, Claire and Daniel sat in silence just beyond the glow of the lights. The lake behind them shimmered in the moonlight, rippling gently as if even nature had been stirred by what had happened that day. Claire's bare feet rested in the cool grass. Her ivory dress wrinkled at the hem from all the kneeling, running, and dancing she hadn't planned on doing. Her hand rested in Daniel's lap, fingers entwined with his, still grounding herself in the moment. Daniel was quiet, not out of fatigue, though his muscles throbbed in places that hadn't hurt in years, but because he was still holding on to it. That moment, those seconds where he stood, and the world tilted just enough to change everything. His legs ached, sure, but his heart was full, nearly bursting. He looked over at her, her hair undone, eyes dreamy with leftover tears, and he whispered, "Did I surprise you?" Claire turned to him, her cheek already cradled on his shoulder. "You didn't surprise me," she said softly. "You proved me right." He smiled, but it trembled. "Right about what?" "That love doesn't have to look like anyone else's. That miracles don't always happen in churches or hospitals. Sometimes they roll in quietly, and when they finally rise, the whole world watches." Daniel swallowed hard and kissed the back of her hand. Neither spoke for a while. They didn't need to. The rest of the evening flowed in gentle waves, guests telling them how deeply moved they were, friends whispering that they'd never seen anything like it. Even Maggie, mascara smudged, had pulled Claire into a hug and said, "I was wrong. You didn't settle. You soared." But the real moment, the one Claire would remember years later, came when Evelyn clinked her glass and stood for a toast. The tent hushed. Candles flickered. Claire leaned in, knowing her grandmother didn't speak unless it mattered. "I've seen a lot in my life," Evelyn began, her voice strong and clear. "I've watched the world change in ways I never imagined, but I've never seen anything like what I witnessed today. I saw a man rise, not just to his feet, but to his calling, and I saw a woman choose him, not because of what he could offer, but because of who he already was." She lifted her glass. "To the kind of love that doesn't wait for permission, to the kind of strength that doesn't always come with muscles, and to the kind of moment we'll be talking about until our grandchildren's grandchildren ask why their hearts suddenly feel so full." Everyone stood, raising their glasses high, but Claire's eyes stayed on Daniel, who looked away just briefly, too overwhelmed to meet her gaze. She reached over, cupped his cheek, and brought his eyes back to hers. "This is what real looks like," she said. Later, as the crowd dwindled and candles burned low, Daniel found himself alone in the quiet of their new shared apartment. Claire had gone to change out of her gown, and he sat by the window with a glass of water and a letter in his lap. It was the one she'd written the night before the wedding. Folded neatly, her cursive soft and slanted. He read it again. "My Daniel, if I had 100 lifetimes, I'd choose you in every one. Not for what you've overcome, but for how you make me feel in the quiet. You are my steady, my breath when the world feels tight, my reason to believe that home isn't a place, it's a person. I know the world will always have opinions, but I also know this: no one sees me the way you do. And that's enough to carry me through anything. Love always, Claire." Daniel closed his eyes, the letter pressed to his chest. Not long after, Claire joined him, barefoot and in a simple cotton robe. She sat beside him, tucked her legs under herself, and leaned into him like gravity knew where she belonged. "You okay?" she asked, stroking his arm. "I'm more than okay," he whispered. "I'm home." They didn't talk much after that. They didn't need to. The night spoke for them. Wind through the trees, a soft creak of the floor beneath them, the whisper of the world, returning to normal. But for Claire and Daniel, normal had changed. It now meant something richer, deeper. It meant effort, understanding, and choosing each other, every day. In the months that followed, people would ask them how they did it, how they ignored the doubts, how Daniel stood when he wasn't supposed to, how Claire knew he was the one. They never had a simple answer, because theirs wasn't a story built on grand speeches or fairy tale perfection. It was built on quiet mornings, handwritten letters, and the fierce belief that love isn't about walking in step, it's about standing beside each other, however you can. And Daniel? He did the impossible, not because he had to, but because love gave him the strength to believe that maybe, just maybe, impossible was only a word people used when they'd stopped trying. Claire never needed him to walk. She just needed him to be the man who would rise for her. And he always would. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of this heartfelt journey. If you're still here, it means this story touched something deep inside you, just like it touched us while sharing it. What can we learn from Claire and Daniel? That love isn't about appearances, perfection, or even walking side by side. It's about rising for each other in the ways that matter most. It's about choosing someone again and again, no matter what the world says, no matter what obstacles stand in the way. True love doesn't need legs. It needs heart and courage. We'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop a comment and tell us your city or country. We have a beautiful community here and would be honored to hear your story too. And if this story moved you even a little, please hit that subscribe button so you never miss another one. We share stories just like this, raw, emotional, and real, every week. Because sometimes, all it takes is a single story to remind us of the power of love. See you in the next one.